A man nearly froze to death in a blizzard, and the only thing that saved him was a door buried beneath a mountain. Behind it, $305 million that no one on Earth knew existed. Before we dive into this story, make sure to smash that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story that will blow your mind. Let's get started. The mountains of Montana don't forgive mistakes. They don't warn you twice. They don't care about your name, your past, or the reason you came up here in the first place. They just take. And for a man named Eli, they had already taken everything worth having. He'd been living alone on the mountain for 6 years. No phone, no radio, no neighbors for 30 miles in any direction. His cabin sat at 4,200 feet, a rough-hewn structure of cedar and stone he had built with his own hands, one log at a time, through 2 winters of solitude and grief so heavy it had no name. The nearest town, a place called Ridgemont, sat at the base of the range, a quiet cluster of buildings that had once been full of life. A school, a general store, a diner where people gathered on Sunday mornings. Now it was mostly empty. Most of the families had left years ago, drifting toward cities, toward work, toward anywhere that wasn't a dying town at the foot of a mountain that had nothing left to give. Eli had been one of them once, not a miner, a teacher. He'd spent 8 years at the Ridgemont Elementary, teaching 4th grade in a classroom with cracked windows and radiators that clanked like old bones. He loved it. He loved the kids especially, the ones who came in with mud on their boots and questions too big for the room. He loved the way a child's face would light up when something clicked, when a sentence turned into understanding, when the world suddenly made a little more sense. He had a wife then. Her name was Clara, and a son. A boy of 7 named Jonah, with his mother's eyes and his father's laugh, the kind of laugh that filled a room without trying. They lived in a small house just off the main road, the kind of place where the porch light stayed on and the screen door never quite closed all the way. It was small. It was imperfect. It was everything. Then, one February morning, 18 months before Eli retreated to the mountain, Clara and Jonah drove to the next town for groceries. The roads were icy. The other driver ran a red light. Eli didn't hear the news for 2 hours. He was in the middle of a lesson on fractions when the sheriff walked into his classroom with a look on his face that Eli had never seen before and would never forget. A look that said the world had just split open and there was no stitching it back together. He didn't remember the funeral. Not really. He remembered the cold. He remembered the caskets. 2 of them, side by side, one so small it looked like it belonged to someone else's nightmare. He remembered Ruth, the woman who ran the general store, pressing a casserole into his hands and saying something about God's plan. He didn't hear her. He didn't hear anyone for weeks after that. The grief didn't arrive like a wave. It arrived like weather, slow, total, and everywhere at once. It soaked into the walls of the house, into the sheets, into the silence where Jonah's footsteps used to be. Eli stopped eating regular meals. He stopped grading papers. He stopped going to the school entirely. By spring, he had packed a single bag, locked the front door, and walked into the mountains. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't say goodbye. He just left, the way a man leaves when staying would mean drowning in plain sight. The first year was the hardest. Not because of the cold or the isolation or the weeks without another human voice. It was hard because the mountain was honest. Out there, you couldn't pretend. You couldn't numb yourself with noise or routine or other people's company. You were alone with the silence, and the silence made you face things you had spent your whole life looking away from. Eli cried. Not often. But when he did, it was ugly and raw and long. He cried for Clara. He cried for Jonah. He cried for the life he had walked away from, the students who probably wondered where he went, the town that slowly forgot his name. But the mountain also taught him something. It taught him that survival was not a gift. It was a practice. Every morning, he woke before dawn and worked. He chopped wood. He checked his traps. He repaired the cabin, sealed the cracks, reinforced the roof against the weight of winter snow. He learned to hunt elk and gut a fish in under 4 minutes. He learned to read the sky the way a sailor reads the sea, Every cloud, every shift in wind, every change in temperature told him something about what was coming. By the second year, his grief had not disappeared. It never fully would, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a crushing weight on his chest. It was more like a scar, permanent, always there, but something he could live around if he moved carefully enough. By the third year, he had stopped thinking about going back down. 6 years in, Eli was 44 years old, lean and sun-weathered, with hands that had grown rough as bark and eyes that had grown quiet in a way that unsettled anyone who looked into them too long. He didn't think of himself as brave or strong. He thought of himself as someone who had simply stopped expecting anything from the world. That was the morning the mountain decided to test him. Late October. The sky had been grey for 3 days straight, low and heavy, pressing down on the peaks like a lid on a jar. Eli had noticed the shift in pressure 2 nights before, the way the wind changed direction, the way the elk moved down from the ridgeline, restless and nervous. He knew what was coming, a real storm, the kind that didn't just snow, the kind that buried things alive. He spent the morning preparing. He reinforced the firewood stack, checked the water barrels, sealed the cabin door with an extra layer of canvas. By early afternoon, the first flakes had begun to fall, small, dry, almost gentle, but Eli knew better than to trust them. He had set traps that morning along the creek bed, 1/2 mile east of the cabin. He needed to check them before the storm hit. It was a 20-minute walk in good conditions. He grabbed his pack, his knife, and a small oil lantern and headed out. The walk down to the creek was quiet. The forest was already holding its breath. Birds had gone silent. The pines swayed in a wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Eli moved quickly, his boots crunching through a thin layer of fresh powder. He checked the traps. 2 rabbits. He reset them, tied the catch to his pack, and started the walk back. That was when the sky fell. It didn't happen gradually. One moment, Eli could see the tree line 50 yards ahead. The next, the world turned white. Not white like snow, white like nothing, like the air itself had been replaced with something solid and blinding. The wind hit him like a wall, sudden and violent, stealing the breath from his lungs before he could draw it back. A whiteout. Eli had seen storms before. Bad ones. The kind that rattled the cabin for days and buried the woodpile under 4 feet of snow. But he had never been caught outside in one. Not like this. He stopped moving immediately. Running in a whiteout was how men died. You walked off a cliff, into a ravine, into a tree at full speed. You panicked. You kept walking in circles until your legs gave out, and the cold took you while you sat in the snow, wondering which direction was up. Eli breathed, slow, steady. He turned his back to the wind and took stock. He could not see his own hand in front of his face. The cold was already biting into his fingers, his ears, the exposed skin around his neck. His lantern was useless. The flame had died the instant the wind hit it. He needed shelter. Not eventually, now. He remembered the terrain. The creek ran east. The cabin was northwest. He was standing in a shallow valley between 2 ridges. If he moved west, carefully, 1 step at a time, hands out in front of him, he would eventually hit the base of the western ridge. There were overhangs there, rocky alcoves where the mountain curved inward on itself, natural shelters carved by centuries of erosion and water. He had passed one years ago during an early exploration, a deep indent in the rock face, maybe 10 feet wide, deep enough to block the wind. It wasn't far, maybe a 1/4 mile. Eli started walking. Each step was a negotiation with the wind. It pushed him sideways, threw him off balance, stole his footing on the uneven ground. He kept one arm out, feeling for trees, rocks, anything solid. His boots slipped on hidden ice beneath the snow. Once he went down hard on one knee, the impact jolting up through his leg like a lightning strike. He stayed down for a moment, breathing through clenched teeth, then pushed himself back up and kept moving. Time stopped meaning anything. He didn't know if he had been walking for 10 minutes or 40. The cold was doing something to his thoughts, making them slow, thick, like trying to think through water. His fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. The tip of his nose burned. Then his right hand hit stone. He stopped, pressed his palm flat against the rock face. It was cold enough to sting even through the leather of his glove, but it was solid, real. He turned his body so his back was against the wall and began moving along it, one hand trailing the surface, searching for the indent he remembered. 5 steps, 10. The rock curved, then it curved again, sharper, and suddenly the wind dropped. Not gone, but muffled, like someone had thrown a blanket over it. Eli stepped forward and felt the air change. Drier, stiller, sheltered. He had found it. The overhang was deeper than he remembered, maybe 15 feet back from the opening, wide enough to stand in comfortably. The ground was rocky but relatively flat, dusted with old snow that had blown in and settled. Eli collapsed against the back wall, sliding down until he was sitting, legs stretched out, chest heaving. He sat there for a long time, just breathing. The storm screamed outside, but in here the sound was distant, almost abstract, a white noise that filled the dark without penetrating it. His hands were shaking, his jaw ached from clenching against the cold. But he was alive. He pulled the lantern from his pack and, after several attempts with stiff fingers, managed to light it. The flame flickered once, twice, then steadied. Warm orange light spilled across the alcove, and for the first time, Eli could see where he was. The overhang was natural, carved by wind and water over thousands of years. The walls were smooth in places, rough and jagged in others. The ceiling sloped downward at the back, forcing anyone standing there to duck. And the floor... Eli squinted, leaning forward. The floor was not entirely stone. He held the lantern lower, closer to the ground near the back wall. There, half buried under a layer of dirt, old leaves and decades of accumulated debris, was something that did not belong. Timber. Thick wooden beams, horizontal, running along the base of the back wall. Old. Dark with age and moisture. And beside them, poking out from under the earth like bones from a grave, iron bolts. Heavy. Industrial. The kind of hardware used in mining shafts or structural supports built to last generations. Eli crawled forward, the lantern in one hand. His breath came faster now, not from cold, but from something else. That old instinct, the one that fires when a pattern breaks, when something shows up where it has no business being. He brushed away dirt with his free hand. More timber appeared, more bolts. And then, beneath a thick crust of dried mud and compacted snow, the outline of a door. It was rectangular, about 5 feet tall, set directly into the rock face, iron-banded, heavy. The kind of door you built when you needed something to stay shut for a very long time. Eli sat back on his heels and stared at it. The storm howled outside, indifferent. The lantern flame danced in a draft he couldn't feel. He should have stopped. Every rational part of his mind told him to stop. To focus on survival. To conserve warmth, conserve energy, wait out the storm, and come back in daylight when he could think clearly. But Eli had spent 6 years with nothing but his own thoughts for company. And in all that time, in all those silent mornings and long dark nights, the one thing that had kept him moving, kept him building, kept him setting traps, kept him breathing, was curiosity. It was the last fire still burning inside him, the last thing that made him feel human. He set the lantern down and started clearing the door. It took him the better part of an hour. The dirt was frozen in places, hard as concrete, and he had to work around the iron bands carefully, afraid of disturbing whatever was behind the frame. His fingers ached. His knees grew numb against the cold ground. But he kept going, scraping, brushing, pulling away handfuls of earth and old wood rot until the full shape of the door was revealed. There was no handle, just a keyhole, large, old-fashioned, the kind made for a heavy skeleton key. Eli studied it for a moment, then ran his hands along the base of the door, along the seams, feeling for anything loose. His fingers found it near the bottom right corner, a loose stone set into the rock beside the frame. Not natural, placed. He pried it out with his knife. Behind it was a small cavity in the rock, and inside the cavity, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept it dry for what must have been decades, was a key. Iron, thick, heavy in his palm. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the door. Then he looked at the storm still raging outside, sealing him in, making sure he wasn't going anywhere for hours. He put the key in the lock. It turned with a sound like a cannon shot, a deep, grinding click that echoed off the walls of the alcove and seemed to travel somewhere far beneath his feet. Something shifted. Something old and heavy and long still moved for the first time in what might have been years or decades. The door did not swing open. It groaned inward, inch by inch, pulled by its own weight, hinges screaming in protest. Cold air rushed out from the gap, not the cold of outside, not the sharp bite of a Montana blizzard. This was different. This was the cold of deep underground, dry, still, the kind of air that had been sealed away from the world for a very long time. Eli held the lantern forward and looked into the darkness beyond the door. A staircase. Stone steps, narrow, descending at a steep angle into blackness. The walls on either side were rough-hewn rock, shored up with timber supports that matched the beams outside the door. The craftsmanship was old but solid, the kind of work done by men who knew how to build things meant to last. He descended slowly, one hand on the wall, the lantern held out in front of him. Each step took him deeper, the air growing colder and stiller with every foot. The sound of the storm above faded, swallowed by stone and earth, until there was nothing but the soft scrape of his boots and the occasional drip of moisture somewhere in the dark. The staircase went down for about 30 steps. Then it opened. Eli stopped at the bottom and held the lantern as high as he could. The chamber was large, larger than he expected, maybe 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a ceiling that arched overhead like the inside of a cathedral. The walls were lined with timber supports and rough stone, the same construction as the staircase. The air was cold but dry, remarkably so. No mold, no rot. Whatever had built this place had built it to preserve, and preservation was exactly what it had done. Rows of wooden crates lined both sides of the chamber, stacked 2 and 3 high, each one roughly the size of a footlocker. They were stamped with stenciled markings, numbers, dates, codes, but the lantern light was too dim to read them clearly. Eli counted as his eyes swept the room. 20 crates, 30, more, maybe 40 or 50 in total. He moved forward slowly, as if the wrong step might shatter whatever spell was keeping this place intact. The floor was swept clean, not naturally but deliberately. Someone had maintained this space. Someone had come here regularly and made sure everything stayed dry, stayed sealed, stayed hidden. Eli reached the nearest crate and set the lantern down beside it. The wood was dark with age but solid, the lid held in place by a simple iron latch. No lock. He lifted the latch and pushed the lid open. Inside, wrapped in layers of oiled cloth, were bars of metal. Gold, dense, heavy, gleaming dully in the lantern light, each one stamped with a weight and a mark he didn't immediately recognize. He reached in and lifted one. It was heavier than he expected, solid, cold, unmistakably real. His hands were trembling. He set the bar back down carefully as if it were made of glass. Then he stood and looked around the chamber again, the lantern swinging slightly in his grip, casting long shadows that danced across the crates like something alive. Dozens of them, all of them sealed, all of them waiting. Eli stood in the center of that underground room, surrounded by silence so complete it had a sound of its own, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Not grief, not fear, but something older and stranger, something that felt a little like fate, and a little like the world finally, after 6 years of silence, having something to say. Eli did not sleep that night. He couldn't have, even if he had wanted to. The storm still raged above him, sealing the entrance to the overhang like a lid on a tomb. But down here in the vault, the world had gone completely still. The only sound was the occasional pop of the lantern flame and the soft rhythm of his own breathing, which seemed too loud in a space that had known nothing but silence for what he was beginning to suspect was a very, very long time. He spent the first hour simply walking the chamber, back and forth, crate to crate, running his hands along the lids, reading the stenciled markings as best he could in the flickering light. Most of the stamps were numerical, sequential codes, probably inventory numbers, but a few had dates, and the dates told him something important. The earliest stamp he found read 1943. The latest read 1971, 28 years. Someone had been adding to this collection over the better part of 3 decades, one crate at a time, carrying gold and whatever else was inside down these stone steps and sealing it away from the world. Eli opened a second crate. More gold bars, identical to the first. Dense, stamped, cold to the touch. He lifted one and turned it over in the lantern light. The stamp on the face read a weight, 10 troy ounces, and a mark he didn't recognize, a small circle with 2 letters inside. He set it back down and moved to the next crate. This one was different, lighter. When he pried the lid, he found not gold but silver, long, flat ingots wrapped in oiled cloth, each one stamped with a similar mark but heavier in volume. Dozens of them, stacked in neat rows like books on a shelf. The silver gleamed dully beneath the cloth, untouched by tarnish or time. He moved deeper into the chamber, past the main rows of crates toward the far wall. There, set apart from the others, were 6 wooden boxes of a different shape, longer, shallower, more carefully constructed. The wood was darker, finer, the joints tighter. These weren't storage crates. These were cases. Eli knelt beside the first one and opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of protective cloth and separated by sheets of acid-free paper, were paintings. Framed paintings. He lifted the top one carefully, holding the lantern close. It was a landscape, rolling hills beneath a sky heavy with clouds, a river cutting through golden fields. The style was old, 19th century, maybe earlier. The colors were rich, deep, almost luminous even in the dim light. Eli didn't know much about art. He had never been the type to stand in museums studying brushstrokes, but he knew enough to recognize that this was not a print. This was not a reproduction. This was the real thing, painted by someone's hand, one stroke at a time, and it was beautiful. He set it down and checked the next case. More paintings, different styles, different subjects. A portrait of a man in dark clothing, a seascape with ships dissolving into mist, an abstract piece in violent reds and blacks that seemed to vibrate with energy even in stillness. Each one carefully preserved, each one separated and cushioned like something fragile and irreplaceable. Because that was exactly what they were. Eli closed the cases and stood slowly, his knees aching from crouching on cold stone. He turned in a full circle, the lantern held high, casting its warm circle of light against the rough walls. The chamber stretched around him, dense with crates, heavy with secrets. He tried to count them again, the gold crates, the silver crates, the art cases, but his mind kept losing track, kept slipping back to the same impossible question. Who did this, and why? The answer, as it turned out, was waiting for him at the far end of the room. In the deepest corner of the vault, partially obscured by 2 tall crates stacked against the wall, sat a desk. A real desk. Solid oak, dark with age, the kind of heavy piece of furniture that looked like it had been carried down those narrow stairs in pieces and assembled in place. It was the only piece of furniture in the entire chamber, and it sat there with an authority that made Eli stop and stare at it the way you might stare at a person who had been watching you without speaking. He moved the lantern closer and set it on the corner of the desk. On its surface, perfectly centered, as if placed there by careful hands, were 2 things. The first was a leather-bound journal, thick, worn at the edges. The cover was dark brown, cracked with age, and on the front, stamped in faded gold lettering, were 2 words: Private Record. The second was a manila envelope, thick with papers, sealed with a metal clasp. On the front, written in a steady hand with black ink that had faded to a deep brown, were 3 words: For the town. Eli stood at the desk for a long time without touching either one. The lantern flickered. Somewhere deep in the mountain, water dripped against stone in a slow, patient rhythm. The storm above was a memory now, muffled to almost nothing by the weight of earth and rock between him and the sky. Then he pulled the wooden chair out from behind the desk, sat down, and opened the journal. The first page was dated September 14th, 1968. The handwriting was neat, precise, the kind of penmanship that belonged to an older generation, men who had learned to write with care because words once set down were meant to last. The name at the top of the page was Harold Whitmore. Eli knew that name. He had heard it spoken in Ridgemont more times than he could count, always with a complicated mix of respect and resentment that small towns reserve for the men who made them and broke them in equal measure. Harold Whitmore had been a mining magnate, one of the wealthiest men in Montana during the 50s and 60s. He had come to Ridgemont in 1952 with money, equipment, and ambition, and he had torn open the mountain looking for copper and silver. For 2 decades, the Whitmore Mining Company was the heartbeat of the town. It employed half the population. It funded the school, the church, the general store. It put Ridgemont on the map. But Eli also knew what came after. Harold had extracted everything the mountain had to give, and when the veins ran dry in the early 70s, he pulled out. Closed the mine overnight, laid off hundreds of men with barely a week's notice, left the town with nothing but empty shafts, scarred earth, and a population that had no idea how to survive without the industry that had defined them for 20 years. Ridgemont never recovered, not fully, not the way it had been before. Eli turned the page and kept reading. The journal was not a business record. It was a confession. Harold wrote the way a man writes when he knows the clock is running out. With urgency, yes, but also with a strange, aching tenderness that surprised Eli every time it surfaced. The early entries were clinical, almost businesslike. Harold documented the vault's construction, which had begun in 1965, 3 years before the first entry. He wrote about the contractors he had hired, men from out of state, men who would not talk, men who were paid handsomely to disappear when the work was done. He wrote about the gold, which he had been quietly purchasing and stockpiling for years through offshore accounts and private brokers, converting his wealth into physical metal, piece by piece, crate by crate. But as the entries continued, through 1969 into 1970, the tone shifted. The clinical precision gave way to something raw, something guilty. One entry, dated March 3, 1969, read like this: I have spent 30 years building an empire on a mountain that belonged to no one and everyone. I told myself it was progress. I told myself the jobs justified the damage. But I walked through Ridgemont last Tuesday and I saw what I left behind. Not just the closed mine or the empty storefronts. I saw the men I laid off, standing on corners with nothing to do and nowhere to go. I saw their wives working double shifts at jobs that barely covered rent. I saw children who used to run through the streets like they owned them, now quiet, uncertain, as if the ground beneath them had turned to sand. I did that. I took everything this town had and I called it business. And now I am dying, and I have nothing to show for it except money that has already made me miserable. Eli paused. He reread the passage. Then he turned back a few pages and found the entry where Harold first mentioned his illness. It was dated January 19th, 1969. A single line: the doctors say 6 months, maybe less. Pancreatic. They said it plainly, like a weather report. I almost laughed. Harold Whitmore had been dying for over a year before he wrote the entry about Ridgemont. He had known from the beginning that the vault was not about wealth. It was not about legacy in the way most rich men understood it. It was about redemption. Eli kept reading. Page after page, entry after entry, Harold laid out his plan with meticulous detail. He had spent years quietly liquidating his fortune, selling properties, closing accounts, converting everything into gold, silver, rare coins, and art. Not to hide it from taxes or governments, to hide it from himself, to remove the temptation of spending it, investing it, turning it back into the cold abstraction of money on a page. He wanted it to be real, physical, something you could hold in your hands and feel the weight of. and he wanted all of it to go to Ridgemont. The plan was documented in the manila envelope. Eli opened it after finishing the last entry in the journal, a brief note dated October 8, 1971, written in a hand that was noticeably shakier than the ones before it. The ink had smeared in places, as if Harold's fingers had trembled too much to hold the pen steady. I will not be able to deliver the documents myself. The cancer has taken too much. I have left instructions with my attorney Gerald to contact the town council after my passing and direct them to this location. The key will be left where it can be found. I can only hope that someone, someday, opens this door and does what I could not. Give it back. All of it. Every cent. Let them rebuild what I destroyed. That is all I ask. The envelope contained the legal framework Harold had prepared. Transfer documents, property deeds, a proposed trust structure that would distribute the funds to Ridgemont over a period of 20 years. There were letters to the town council, to the mayor at the time, to the school board. Letters that explained everything: the vault, the contents, the reason. Letters that had never been delivered. Because Harold's attorney, Gerald, had died 8 months after Harold, a heart attack, sudden and silent, in the winter of 1972. The documents had stayed in the envelope, the key had stayed in its hiding place, and the vault had stayed sealed, forgotten, buried beneath decades of rockfall and snow and the slow, patient work of time. Eli set the envelope down on the desk and leaned back in the chair. The lantern was burning lower now, the flame shrinking as the oil depleted. He didn't move to adjust it. He just sat there in the growing dimness, the journal open in his lap, Harold's last words still echoing in his mind. He thought about Ridgemont. He thought about the town the way it had been when he lived there. Not thriving, but alive. Families on porches in the evenings, kids on bikes in the streets, Ruth at the general store, always smiling, always asking how your day was going, even when she already knew the answer was not great. The school where he taught, where 32 kids sat in rows and learned that the world was bigger than the mountain they lived beside. And then he thought about Ridgemont the way it was now, or at least the way he imagined it was, since he hadn't set foot in the town in over 4 years. He had heard things on the rare occasions he came down for supplies. The school had closed, the diner shut down. Half the houses on the main street were vacant, windows dark, yards overgrown. Ruth's store was still open, barely, surviving on stubbornness and the handful of families too stubborn to leave. Harold had wanted to fix all of that. He had spent years preparing the means to do it, and it had sat here in the dark, untouched, for over 50 years. Eli looked around the vault one final time. The crates, the cases, the desk, the journal, all of it waiting, patient as stone, for someone to come through that door. He picked up the lantern and began to count. It took him the rest of the night and most of the following morning. The storm had broken sometime before dawn. He could feel it in the change of pressure, the subtle shift in the air that filtered down through the overhang above. But he didn't go back up. Not yet. There was work to do first. He opened every crate, every single one. He counted the gold bars carefully, recording each one on the back of a page torn from Harold's journal. Eli hoped the old man would forgive him for it. 43 crates of gold. Each crate contained between 60 and 80 bars, depending on the size. He estimated the average weight at 10 troy ounces per bar. The math, when he finally worked it out with a stub of pencil, made him set the pencil down and stare at the wall for several minutes. The gold alone, at current market prices, which he could only approximate from memory since he had no way to check, was worth somewhere in the range of $240 million. Maybe more, maybe less, but in that neighborhood, an astronomical number. A number so large it lost all meaning and became something abstract again, the very thing Harold had been trying to avoid. The silver was worth considerably less per bar, but there were more of it, 31 crates, densely packed. Eli estimated the silver at somewhere between $30 and $40 million, though he was less confident in that number. The art was harder. Eli was no expert. He had no idea what any of the paintings were worth individually. But he knew enough. had seen enough magazine covers, enough news stories about auction houses and record sales, to understand that a collection of original paintings this well preserved, this carefully curated, could easily be worth tens of millions more. Some of the pieces might be worth millions on their own. He simply didn't know. There were also, in a small locked box he found tucked behind the desk, several glass cases of rare coins. Gold and silver, spanning centuries. Some of them looked old enough to predate the United States entirely. Eli didn't touch them. He just looked. The way you look at something that belongs to a world you don't fully understand. When he finally added everything up, the gold, the silver, the art, the coins, the rough estimates stacked on top of rough estimates, the number he arrived at was staggering. $305 million, give or take, maybe more. Eli sat on the cold stone floor at the base of the stairs, the lantern beside him, Harold's journal in his hands, and let the number settle into his mind like snow settling onto a frozen lake. Slow, silent, total. He had come down here because a door was in his way. He had opened it because he was curious. And now he was sitting in the middle of the largest single discovery he had ever heard of, made by a man who had spent 6 years talking to no one, in a vault that the rest of the world had no idea existed. The weight of it pressed on him in a way the cold never had. Not the weight of the gold, the weight of the choice. He could keep this secret. He could seal the door, bury it again, walk back to his cabin and live out the rest of his days on the mountain, alone and unburdened, the way he had chosen to live for the past 6 years. No one would ever know. Harold's plan would stay unfinished. Ridgemont would continue its slow, quiet decline. And Eli would carry this secret the way he carried everything else, in silence, without complaint, until the mountain finally took him too. Or he could do what Harold had asked. He could give it back. Eli closed the journal and held it against his chest. The lantern sputtered once, the flame dancing like it was trying to stay alive. Outside, somewhere above him, the storm had passed and the mountain was settling back into its ancient stillness. He thought about Clara. He thought about Jonah. He thought about the way his son used to ask questions, endless, relentless questions about everything, and how Eli had never once told him to stop asking. Because questions, he had believed back then, were how you found out what mattered. He thought about a town full of people who had stopped asking, who had stopped expecting anything from the world, who had, like him, quietly given up. And he thought about a dying man named Harold, who had spent his last months carrying gold down stone steps in the dark, not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he wanted to be forgiven. What happens next will change everything Eli thought he knew about himself, about the town he left behind, and about what it means to find something when you have stopped believing there is anything left to find. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The morning after the storm, Eli climbed back up through the overhang and stepped out into a world transformed. The mountain was white and still, every surface smoothed and softened by the overnight snowfall. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that burned your lungs in a way that felt almost good. Like the mountain was reminding you it was still there, still alive, still paying attention. He stood at the edge of the overhang for a long time, looking out at the landscape. The trees below were bent under the weight of fresh snow. The creek, somewhere down in the valley, was invisible beneath a white sheet. And beyond the ridgeline, barely visible in the pale morning light, he could just make out the distant smudge of Ridgemont, nestled at the base of the mountain like something the land had forgotten to shake loose. He hadn't been down there in over 4 years, not since the last time he needed supplies, flour, salt, ammunition, and had driven in and out of town without stopping, without speaking to anyone, without looking anyone in the eye. He had been a ghost to them for years, and they, in turn, had become ghosts to him. But now, standing in the cold with Harold's journal tucked inside his coat, Eli felt the distance between himself and that town shrink in a way he hadn't expected. It wasn't just proximity. It was connection, the sudden uncomfortable awareness that his story and Ridgemont's story were not as separate as he had believed. Harold had made his fortune on that mountain. He had destroyed the town in the process, and now, 50 years later, the man who had fled that same town in grief was standing at the entrance to the old man's confession, holding the key to everything Harold had tried to give back. Eli spent the next 3 days in the vault. He returned each morning before sunrise, descending the stairs with a fresh lantern and a notebook he had found in his cabin, a plain composition book, half filled with old grocery lists and weather notes. He began documenting everything, every crate, every bar, every painting. He sketched the layout of the chamber, noted the condition of the walls and supports, recorded the dates on every stamp he could find. He also continued reading Harold's journal, not just the entries about the vault, but all of it. The earlier pages, the ones written in 1966 and 67, before the illness, when Harold was still healthy and still believed he had time to do things differently. Those pages were different, quieter. Harold wrote about Ridgemont the way a man writes about a place he has come to love too late. He wrote about the children he saw playing in the streets and how their laughter made him feel something he couldn't name. He wrote about the old families, the miners and their wives, and how they had built a community out of nothing, out of dust and hard work, and the stubborn belief that this place was worth staying for. One entry, dated June 11, 1967, stayed with Eli long after he set the journal down. I drove through town today, stopped at the general store for coffee. A woman named Ruth runs it. She smiled at me the way she smiles at everyone, like you are the most important person in the room. I have not felt that in 30 years. I have spent my life surrounded by people who wanted something from me. Ruth wanted nothing. She just wanted to make sure I had a warm cup and a place to sit. I sat there for an hour, watching the town move around me, and I realized something I should have understood decades ago. This place was never mine to take. It was never mine to run. It belonged to them. It always did. I just borrowed it and called it progress. Eli read that passage 3 times. Then he closed the journal and sat in the dark for a long while, listening to the silence of the vault and thinking about Ruth, about the woman he remembered from his own years in Ridgemont, older now, probably in her 70s, still running that store, still smiling at strangers like they mattered. On the 4th day, Eli made his decision. Not all at once, not in a single dramatic moment. It came to him gradually, the way dawn comes, one shade of light at a time, until suddenly the darkness is gone and you can't remember what it felt like to be in it. He was going back down to Ridgemont. He was going to find Ruth, and he was going to tell her what was beneath the mountain. But first, he needed to understand something. He needed to know what the town looked like now. Not from a distance, not from rumor and assumption, but up close, with his own eyes. Because if he was going to do this, if he was going to carry Harold's secret out of this vault and into the open, he needed to know exactly what he was carrying it toward. So on the 5th morning after the storm, Eli packed his bag, sealed the vault door, and began the long walk down the mountain. The descent took most of the day. The fresh snow made the trails treacherous, and Eli moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The air warmed as he dropped in altitude, the brutal cold of the high peaks giving way to something almost mild by the time he reached the tree line. Pine forests closed around him, thick and quiet, the branches heavy with white. He reached the edge of town just before sunset, and what he saw stopped him cold at the tree line, one hand resting against a pine trunk, his breath hanging in the air like a question. Ridgemont was smaller than he remembered, not just quieter, smaller. The main street, which had once stretched 3 full blocks of shops and businesses, now looked like it had been cut in half. Buildings sat dark and empty on one side. Windows were boarded. A storefront he remembered as a hardware shop had collapsed entirely, its roof caved in under the weight of seasons of snow. Weeds grew through cracks in the sidewalk. The street itself was barely maintained. Potholes filled with ice, the painted lines faded to ghosts. But there were still lights on, not many. A handful of houses at the far end of the street glowed with the warm yellow of interior lamps. And there, at the corner of Main and 2nd, Exactly where it had always been, Ruth's general store still stood. Its sign was crooked, the paint was peeling, but the front window was lit, and through it, Eli could see shelves still stocked, a counter still wiped clean, and a woman moving behind it with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this for decades. He stood at the edge of town for a long time, watching the light in that window. The cold pressed against his face. The mountain loomed behind him, enormous and indifferent, keeping its secret close to its chest. He didn't go in. Not that night. He wasn't ready, not yet. He needed more time to figure out how to say what needed to be said, how to explain a 50-year-old dead man's guilt and a vault full of gold to a woman who had probably stopped expecting good news from the mountain a long time ago. So he turned and walked back up into the darkness, the journal pressed against his chest like a heartbeat, and began to plan. Over the next week, Eli made the trip down to town 3 more times. Each time he came closer. Each time he watched a little longer. He saw the handful of families who still lived there, maybe 15, 20 households at most. He saw children, a few of them, playing in a yard behind one of the surviving houses. He saw an older man splitting wood on a porch, methodical and slow, the kind of man who had been doing it so long his body had memorized the motion. And he saw a teenager, a boy of maybe 16, lanky and serious, with dark hair and a quiet way of moving through the world that reminded Eli so sharply of Jonah that he had to look away the first time he saw him. The boy's name, he learned from overheard conversation at the edge of town, was Mason. He lived with his grandmother in one of the houses near the end of the street. He spent most of his afternoons at Ruth's store, helping stock shelves, sweeping the floor, doing the kinds of small tasks that kept a place alive when there wasn't enough money to hire help. Eli watched Mason work one afternoon from across the street, hidden behind the bare branches of an old maple tree. The boy moved with care, not laziness but thoughtfulness. He stacked cans with attention to detail, aligned the labels, swept the floor in long, even strokes. He was trying. In a town that had given up on trying, this boy was still doing it. Something tightened in Eli's chest when he watched Mason, something that felt like grief and hope at the same time. 2 things he had thought he would never feel again, arriving together, unbidden, like old friends showing up at a door he had locked years ago. That night, back in the vault, Eli sat at Harold's desk one more time. He opened the journal to the last entry. Harold's shaking hand, the smeared ink, the final wish, and read it again. "Give it back, all of it, every cent. Let them rebuild what I destroyed." Eli closed the journal. He set it back on the desk, exactly where he had found it. Then he looked around the chamber one last time, at the crates, the cases, the silence, the weight of $305 million sitting in the dark, waiting to change the lives of people who had no idea it existed. He stood up, picked up the lantern, and began to climb the stairs. Tomorrow, he would go back down to Ridgemont. Tomorrow, he would walk into Ruth's store for the first time in 6 years. Tomorrow, he would sit at the counter, wrap his hands around a cup of coffee, and begin to tell her a story about a dead man, a mountain, and a door that had been waiting half a century for someone brave enough to open it. And for the first time since Clara and Jonah died, Eli felt something stir inside him that he barely recognized. Something quiet, something tentative but unmistakable. It felt like purpose. Eli had always been a man of routine. Even on the mountain, where the days blurred together like watercolors left in the rain, he kept a rhythm. Wake before dawn, check the traps, eat, work, eat again, sleep. The routine was not comfort, it was armor. It kept the mind from wandering into places it wasn't safe to go. But that routine shattered the morning he walked into Ruth's store. He stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds before she noticed him. The bell above the door had long since stopped working. The spring was broken, the little brass clapper hanging limp and silent, so Ruth didn't look up until his shadow crossed the counter. When she did, she froze. Her hand, which had been wiping down the glass display case with a worn cloth, stopped mid-stroke. Her eyes went wide, then soft, then something complicated that Eli couldn't quite read. "Eli," she said. Just his name. No question mark, no shock. Like she had been expecting him. Maybe not today, but sometime. Like the mountain had finally decided to send him back, and she wasn't surprised in the least. He nodded. His throat felt tight. He hadn't spoken to another human being in weeks, maybe longer. The words felt clumsy in his mouth, like tools he had forgotten how to use. "Ruth," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. She didn't ask where he'd been. She didn't ask why he had disappeared. She didn't ask any of the questions a normal person would ask when someone they hadn't seen in over 4 years walked through their door looking like he'd been swallowed by the wilderness and spat back out. She just poured him a cup of coffee. Black. Set it on the counter in front of him without a word. Then she went back to wiping the glass case, humming something low and tuneless, as if this were just another Tuesday and Eli had just come in from next door. He sat on the stool at the counter and wrapped his hands around the mug. The warmth seeped into his fingers, into his palms, into something deeper that he couldn't name. He stared into the dark liquid and breathed. The store was smaller than he remembered. Or maybe it had always been this size, and he had simply inflated it in his memory over the years, the way grief tends to expand the things it touches. The shelves were half-stocked: canned goods, dried pasta, a few bottles of cleaning solution, some basic toiletries. The produce section, if you could call it that, held a handful of apples, a bag of potatoes, and a bundle of carrots that had seen better days. A single cooler hummed in the corner, its light flickering intermittently, but it was clean, organized, cared for. Ruth had kept this place alive through sheer force of will, the way a lighthouse keeper keeps the flame burning even when no ships are in sight. They sat in silence for a long time. It was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled, the kind that existed between two people who understood that sometimes presence was enough. Eli drank his coffee slowly. Ruth restocked a shelf of soap bars. Outside, the November light was thin and grey, filtering through the front window like something tired. It was Ruth who spoke first, and when she did, her voice was gentle. "Mason's been asking about you," she said, not looking up from the shelf. Eli's hands tightened around the mug. "What do you mean?" "He found an old yearbook at the school before it closed, saw your picture, looked you up." She paused. "He's a curious boy. Reminds me of someone." Eli didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew who she meant. Ruth turned back to the counter and leaned against it, her arms folded loosely across her chest. She was older than he remembered, 72, maybe 73, but her eyes were the same, clear, warm, the kind of eyes that saw through things without judging what they found. "You didn't come back here for coffee, Eli," she said quietly. He looked up, met her gaze, and for a moment, the weight of everything he was carrying, the vault, the gold, Harold's journal, the impossible choice, pressed down on him so hard he thought his chest might crack open right there in the middle of her store. But he wasn't ready, not yet. He needed more time, more information, more certainty that what he was about to do would actually help and not make things worse. "Not today," he said softly, "but soon." Ruth studied him for a long beat. Then she nodded, like she understood, like she had been waiting for exactly this kind of answer. "I'll be here," she said simply. He finished his coffee, left a crumpled $5 bill on the counter, the only cash he had, and walked back out into the cold. Over the next 2 weeks, Eli fell into a new routine. Each morning he made the descent from the mountain, arriving in Ridgemont just as the town stirred to life, if stirring was even the right word for a place that moved this slowly. He didn't announce himself. He didn't seek people out. He simply existed in the town's periphery, watching, listening, relearning the landscape of a place he had once called home. He learned things. Small things. Important things. He learned that Ruth's store was the only business still operating on Main Street. The diner had closed 2 years ago. The gas station ran dry every few weeks and took days to restock. There was no doctor in town anymore. The nearest clinic was 40 miles away in Clayton Ridge. The elementary school, where Eli had once taught 32 kids about fractions and the solar system, was shuttered. Its windows were dark. its playground equipment rusted in place, swings hanging motionless like something frozen mid-breath. He learned that the population of Ridgemont had dropped to fewer than 60 people, down from over 300 when the mine was still open, down from the bustling little community Harold Whitmore had drained and abandoned decades ago. He learned that the families who remained were stubborn, proud, and slowly running out of options. They grew what they could. They drove long distances for work. They kept their heads down and their doors locked and tried not to think too hard about the future. And he learned about Mason. The boy appeared in Eli's orbit almost every day, though neither of them acknowledged it at first. Mason spent his afternoons at Ruth's store working silently, efficiently. He carried boxes from the back room to the shelves, he swept the floor, he fixed a leaky pipe under the sink with a confidence that suggested he had taught himself, watching videos on a phone with spotty service or simply figuring it out through trial and error. One afternoon, Eli was sitting on a bench outside the store, the same bench that had been there for as long as he could remember, its wooden slats worn smooth by decades of use, when Mason came out with a box of empty cans to recycle. The boy stopped when he saw Eli, not with fear or suspicion, but with a quiet curiosity that reminded Eli again painfully of Jonah. "You're the teacher," Mason said. "Not a question." Eli nodded. "The one from the yearbook." "That's me." Mason set the box down and studied Eli with an expression that was too serious for a 16-year-old, too knowing. The kind of face that had seen things it shouldn't have had to see yet, loss maybe, or disappointment, or simply the slow erosion of a town that had nothing left to offer a boy with questions. "Why'd you leave?" Mason asked. It was a simple question, the kind kids ask without thinking about the weight behind it, but Eli felt it land like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything he was trying to keep calm and contained. "I lost someone," Eli said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Mason's expression didn't change, didn't shift to pity or discomfort. It just settled into understanding, the way it does in small towns, where everyone knows everyone else's grief, even if no one talks about it. "My dad left too," Mason said after a moment. "Different reason, but same thing, I guess. Just gone." They sat in silence for a while after that, two people who understood what it meant to have something disappear without warning. The cold pressed in around them. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then went quiet. It was during one of these afternoons, about 10 days into his return visits, that Eli first noticed the SUV. It was parked at the far end of Main Street, half hidden behind what used to be the hardware store. Black, clean. Too clean for a town like Ridgemont, where every vehicle wore a permanent coat of dust and road salt. The windows were tinted. The engine idled softly, a low mechanical hum that didn't belong in a place where the loudest sound on most afternoons was the wind moving through dead leaves. Eli noticed it because he was trained to notice things out of place. 6 years on a mountain had sharpened that instinct to a razor's edge. A sound that didn't match the environment, a shape that didn't fit the landscape, a presence that had no business being where it was. He watched the SUV for 3 days before he saw anyone get out of it. On the third day, a man emerged, mid-40s, clean-shaven, dark coat, pressed slacks, shoes that had no business being on an unpaved Montana street. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm and walked down Main Street with the measured confidence of someone conducting a survey, eyes moving, cataloguing, assessing. He stopped at Ruth's store, went inside, and stayed for 20 minutes. Eli waited until the man left before he went in himself. Ruth was behind the counter, her expression carefully neutral in the way it gets when something has unsettled her, but she doesn't want to show it. "Who was that?" Eli asked, keeping his voice casual. Ruth wiped the counter, a habit Eli had noticed that she fell into whenever she was thinking hard about something. "Name's Derek," she said. "Derek Harlan. Said he works for a company called Pinnacle Resource Group. Said they're interested in the land around here, the mountain mostly." Eli's jaw tightened. "Interested how?" "Drilling," Ruth said. The word came out flat, like something she had tasted and found bitter. "Said they think there might be minerals, copper, maybe lithium. Said they wanted to talk to anyone who owned land in the area about purchasing options. Eli stood very still. The store hummed around him. The cooler, the fluorescent light, the old radiator ticking in the corner. But beneath all of it, his mind was racing. Pinnacle Resource Group. He had never heard the name, but the pattern was unmistakable. A corporate entity, well-funded, well-dressed, showing up in a dying town with promises about minerals and money. It was the same playbook Harold Whitmore had run 50 years ago. Different company, different name, same mountain, same hunger. "Did he say how much?" Eli asked. Ruth shook her head. Said he'd be back with numbers. "But Eli—" She leaned forward, lowering her voice like the walls might be listening. "He asked about the old mine shafts, the ones Harold closed. He knew exactly where they were, down to the coordinates." That detail stopped Eli cold. Someone had done their research. Serious research. The kind that involved geological surveys, historical mining records, possibly even satellite imaging. This wasn't a casual inquiry. This was a company that had already decided this mountain was worth pursuing and was now in the process of securing the land to make it happen. And if they were looking at the mountain closely enough to know the locations of old mine shafts, then it was only a matter of time, maybe weeks, maybe days, before their surveys brought them to the overhang, to the vault, to $305 million in gold that had been sitting in the dark, unregistered, undocumented, and legally unclaimed for over 50 years. Eli left Ruth's store that evening with a cold certainty settling into his bones. He walked back up the mountain in the dark, the stars sharp and indifferent above him, and he thought about timing. Harold Whitmore had wanted the gold to go to Ridgemont, but Harold Whitmore was dead. His attorney was dead. The documents he had prepared, the trust structure, the transfer deeds, the legal framework, were 50 years old and had never been filed with any court or government agency. They existed only as pieces of paper in a manila envelope in an underground vault that no one knew about except Eli. If Pinnacle Resource Group discovered the vault before Eli moved, the legal battle would be catastrophic. The gold sat on land that had changed hands multiple times since Harold's death. The mountain itself was federal land in places, state land in others, and privately owned in a patchwork of old mining claims that had never been properly resolved. Any company with deep pockets and aggressive lawyers could tie up ownership in court for years, maybe decades, while the gold sat seized and frozen, benefiting no one. Harold's wish would die in a courtroom. Ridgemont would get nothing, and the mountain would be torn open all over again, this time not for copper or silver, but for the wealth of a dead man who had already tried to give it away. Eli couldn't let that happen. Back at the cabin that night, he sat at his rough-hewn table by the light of a kerosene lamp and spread out everything he had. Harold's journal, the manila envelope with its decades-old legal documents, his own notebook filled with the careful inventory he had made over the past weeks. He stared at it all for a long time, the way a man stares at a map when he knows the destination but can't find the road. He needed help. Not just anyone's help, the right help. Someone who understood land law, trust structures, the legal complexities of undocumented assets. Someone outside of Ridgemont, outside of Montana maybe. Someone clean, someone who couldn't be bought or pressured by a corporation with unlimited resources. And he needed to move fast. The next morning, Eli made the descent again. But this time, he didn't go to Ruth's store. He went to the small library, or what was left of it, at the end of the street. A single room in a building that had once housed the town's post office. It had a computer, ancient and slow, connected to an internet signal so weak it took 3 minutes to load a single page. But it was enough. He sat down at the terminal and began searching. Not for lawyers, not yet. For journalists, investigative reporters who covered land disputes, corporate overreach, environmental exploitation. People who knew how to take a story like this and turn it into something that couldn't be ignored or buried. It took him most of the morning. The connection kept dropping, pages loaded in fragments. But eventually, after scrolling through dozens of names and articles, one stood out. A woman named Dana Marsh, based in Missoula. She had spent the better part of a decade covering corporate land grabs in rural Montana, Stories about mining companies sweeping into small towns, buying up property for pennies, and leaving devastation in their wake. Her articles were sharp, thorough, and unflinching. She had a reputation for protecting her sources and for not backing down when the people she was investigating pushed back. Eli copied down her contact information on a piece of paper, folded it into his jacket pocket, and closed the computer. That afternoon, he returned to the vault one final time before making contact with Dana. He descended the stairs slowly, lantern in hand, the familiar cold air rising to meet him. The chamber was exactly as he had left it. The crates in their rows, the art cases in their corner, Harold's desk at the far end with the journal and envelope sitting where they had always been. He walked the length of the room one more time, slowly, deliberately, taking it in the way you take in something you know is about to change forever. Not just the thing itself, but everything around it. 34 crates of gold, 31 crates of silver, 6 cases of paintings, a box of rare coins, a leather journal filled with a dead man's guilt and a dying man's hope. $305 million, give or take, sitting in the belly of a mountain in a town no one had heard of in years. And somewhere down below, in the thin grey light of a November afternoon, a man named Derek Harlan was walking the streets of Ridgemont with a leather portfolio, asking questions about land that had already been promised to someone else, someone who had died before he could deliver on his promise. Eli stood at the base of the stairs and looked back at the vault one last time. The lantern flame danced against the stone walls, casting shadows that moved like something alive. "Okay, Harold," he said quietly. The words echoed softly in the underground silence. "Let's finish what you started." He climbed the stairs, sealed the door, replaced the key in its hiding place, and walked back out into the cold Montana air. The mountain rose above him, massive and ancient, keeping its secret for just a little while longer. But not much longer. The clock, Eli knew, had started ticking the moment Derek Harlan set foot in Ridgemont. And now, for the first time in 6 years, Eli was not content to let time pass quietly. He had somewhere to be, someone to call, and a story that had waited 50 years to be told. The mountain, for once, was not going to have the last word. Eli called Dana Marsh on a Tuesday morning from the payphone outside the Clayton Ridge post office, the only landline within 40 miles of Ridgemont that still worked. His hands were cold. The receiver was slick with frost. He had driven 2 hours in the dark to make this call, and he still wasn't entirely sure what he was going to say. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was sharp, alert, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had spent years listening for the first note of something important and had learned to recognize it instantly. "Dana Marsh," she said. Eli took a breath. "My name is Eli. I live outside a town called Ridgemont, Montana. I found something under a mountain, something worth $305 million, and there's a corporation trying to get to it before I can give it away." There was a pause on the other end. Not a long one, just long enough for Dana to process what she had just heard and decide whether it was worth her time. "Talk," she said. He talked for 40 minutes. He told her everything. Harold Whitmore, the vault, the gold, the journal, the manila envelope with its undelivered documents, the trust structure that had never been filed. He told her about Ridgemont, about the town's slow decline, about Ruth and Mason and the 60 or so families still clinging to a place the rest of the world had forgotten. And he told her about Derek Harlan and Pinnacle Resource Group, about the black SUV, and the questions about old mine shafts, and the unmistakable smell of a company preparing to move in. Dana listened without interrupting. When Eli finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need to see it, all of it. The vault, the documents, the journal. Can you do that?" "Yes." "When?" "This week, before they find it themselves." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'll be there Thursday." Dana Marsh arrived in Ridgemont on a grey Thursday afternoon in a beat-up Subaru that looked like it had crossed half the state on bad roads and enjoyed every mile of it. She was smaller than Eli had imagined, compact, quick-moving, with dark hair pulled back in a loose knot, and sharp eyes that moved constantly, taking in everything without settling on anything for too long. She wore a worn leather jacket and carried a canvas bag stuffed with notebooks, a digital recorder, and a camera that looked like it had seen serious use. They met at Ruth's store. Eli had arranged it that way. Neutral ground, somewhere warm, somewhere that felt safe. Ruth had set out coffee without being asked, the way she always did, and sat quietly in the back corner with a book she wasn't really reading, close enough to listen, but far enough to give them space. Dana sat across from Eli at the small table near the window. She opened her notebook, clicked a pen, and looked at him with an expression that was all business but not unkind. "Before we go any further," she said, "I need to understand something. You found $305 million. You could disappear with it. You could sell it quietly, piece by piece, and live out your life in comfort. Why aren't you doing that?" Eli wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. He thought about the question for a long time before he answered, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to get it right. "A man named Harold spent the last months of his life carrying gold down stone steps in the dark," Eli said. "Not because he wanted to be rich, because he wanted to say sorry. He wanted to give something back to a town he had destroyed. He died before he could do it. His lawyer died too, and the money sat there in the dark for 50 years, waiting for someone to finish the job." He paused. Outside, the thin grey light shifted behind a cloud. "I spent 6 years on that mountain running away from everything," he continued. "From my wife, from my son, from this town, from anything that required me to feel something I didn't want to feel." He looked at Dana steadily. "Harold didn't get a second chance, but I did. I'm not going to waste it." Dana studied him for a long beat. Then she nodded once and wrote something in her notebook. "Show me the vault," she said. The hike up took the better part of the afternoon. Dana moved slower than Eli, but she didn't complain. She asked questions as they climbed, about the terrain, about the history of the mountain, about Harold Whitmore's mining operations and the community they had built and then dismantled. Eli answered as best he could, filling in the gaps with what he had read in Harold's journal. When they reached the overhang, the late afternoon light was fading fast. Eli retrieved the key from its hiding place, cleared the worst of the debris from the door, and turned the lock. The same grinding click as before, the same rush of cold, dry air. Dana stepped closer, her eyes wide, and watched as the door groaned inward. She didn't say anything as they descended the stairs. Not a word. But Eli noticed her breathing change, quicken, deepen, the way it does when the body registers something the mind hasn't fully caught up to yet. When they reached the bottom and Eli raised the lantern, illuminating the full length of the chamber, Dana stopped walking entirely. She stood at the base of the stairs and stared. The crates, the cases, the desk, the silence. All of it exactly as it had been, undisturbed, patient, waiting. "My God," Dana whispered. Eli let her have the moment. He had felt it himself, that first shock, that breathless disbelief when the scale of what was hidden here finally registered. It didn't get smaller the second time, it just changed shape. Dana spent 3 hours in the vault. She photographed everything, every crate, every stamp, every gold bar she could safely remove and hold up to the lantern. She photographed the art cases, the desk, the journal, the manila envelope, and every document inside it. She recorded herself narrating what she was seeing, her voice steady and precise, the journalist in her taking over from the human who had gasped at the bottom of the stairs. She read Harold's journal cover to cover, sitting at his desk in the exact chair Eli had sat in weeks before. She read it slowly, carefully, pausing at certain passages, rereading them. When she reached the final entry, Harold's shaking hand, his last wish, she set the journal down and pressed her fingers against her closed eyes for a long moment. "This is incredible," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Not just the money, the story, the intent behind it. A man who spent his life taking everything from a town and then spent his death trying to give it all back." She looked at Eli. "Do you understand what this means? If we can get the legal framework right, if we can establish Harold's intent, file the trust, Document the chain of custody. This could actually work. This money could actually go where he wanted it to go. Can we beat Pinnacle to it? Eli asked. Dana's jaw tightened. We have to. Once they file a formal claim on the land, everything under it becomes a legal dispute. And corporations like that have armies of lawyers. We don't have time for armies. We need to move first, move fast, and move publicly. She pulled out her phone. No signal down here, but she was already composing notes. I know a land attorney in Missoula, woman named Patricia. She's handled cases like this before. Unclaimed assets, historical trusts, estate disputes. If anyone can navigate this quickly, it's her. Eli nodded. How fast? Days, not weeks. But I need you to trust me on this, Eli. Once this goes public, everything changes. For you, for this town, for everyone. He looked around the vault one more time. The gold gleaming dully in the lantern light. Harold's desk. The silence that had kept this place hidden for half a century. It already changed, Eli said, the moment I opened that door. The next 72 hours moved at a speed that made Eli's head spin. Dana worked the phones like a woman possessed, calling Patricia in Missoula, calling contacts at the state attorney general's office, calling colleagues who covered corporate land disputes. She worked from Ruth's store, her laptop open on the counter, notebooks spread around her like a battlefield map, coffee going cold beside her keyboard. Patricia arrived on Saturday morning. She was tall, precise, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had won difficult cases and knew exactly how to win another one. She reviewed Harold's documents in 4 hours, interviewed Eli for 2 more, and by Sunday evening had filed an emergency petition with the state court to establish the vault as a protected historical asset pending trust verification. It was not a guarantee. Patricia was clear about that. Pinnacle Resource Group had resources, connections, and legal teams that could challenge the petition at every turn. But the filing itself did something immediate and important. It put the asset on record. It made the vault and everything inside it part of the public domain of legal discourse. Pinnacle could not claim ignorance. They could not quietly absorb it. Any move they made from this point forward would be watched. And then Dana published the story. It ran on Sunday night, online first, a long-form piece in a regional outlet that Patricia had quietly flagged to 3 national editors before it went live. The headline was simple. 50-year-old secret beneath Montana Mountain could rebuild a dying town. By Monday morning, it had been shared 40,000 times. By Tuesday, the phones at the state capitol were ringing. By Wednesday, it was national news. Eli didn't read most of the coverage. He didn't have reliable internet access, and the few articles Ruth showed him on her phone felt strange and distant, like stories about someone else. But he felt the effects immediately. Ridgemont, which had been invisible to the outside world for decades, was suddenly overwhelmingly visible. Reporters showed up. Not just Dana, others from bigger outlets with cameras and crews and questions that came faster than Eli could answer. He turned most of them away. Ruth handled the rest with a firm politeness that had clearly been perfected over decades of dealing with difficult customers. But the attention wasn't all external. Something shifted inside the town itself. It started with the families. Within days of the story breaking, people began showing up at Ruth's store, not to buy groceries but to talk. Old-timers who remembered Harold Whitmore, families whose grandparents had worked in the mine, people who had stayed in Ridgemont when everyone else left, not out of stubbornness alone, but out of a quiet, unspoken belief that this place still mattered. They came with stories, with documents, with yellowed letters and old pay stubs and photographs of the mine in its heyday, hundreds of men going in, hundreds coming out, the mountain alive with the sound of machinery and purpose. And they came with anger, not at Eli, not at Harold, at the 50 years of silence, at the knowledge that a dead man had tried to make things right and the world had simply let his effort disappear into the dark. Ruth organized a town meeting. It was held in the back of her store, the only space large enough, on a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the story broke. Folding chairs were set up in rows. Someone brought a portable heater, Someone else brought coffee and pie. About 40 people showed up. Nearly the entire remaining population of Ridgemont, packed into a room that smelled like sawdust and cinnamon and the particular warmth of people gathering around something that mattered. Eli stood at the front, beside Ruth and Patricia. He was not comfortable in front of people. He had spent years avoiding exactly this, the weight of eyes, the expectation of words. But when he looked out at the faces before him, weathered, tired, hopeful in a way that seemed almost painful, he understood that this was not about him. Patricia spoke first. She laid out the legal situation clearly and without jargon. The petition had been filed. The trust structure Harold had proposed was legally viable, with some modifications. If everything went according to plan, the funds would be distributed through a community trust managed by a board of local residents over a period of 20 years. Schools, infrastructure, jobs, healthcare access, housing, all of it funded by the gold that had been sitting beneath their feet for half a century. The room was silent when she finished. Not the uncomfortable silence of confusion, but the heavy silence of people trying to absorb something too large to hold all at once. Then an old man in the back row, Eli recognized him as someone who had worked in Harold's mine in the 60s, raised his hand slowly. "So, all that money," he said, his voice rough and quiet. "It was meant for us, this whole time?" Patricia nodded. "That was Harold Whitmore's intention, yes." The old man shook his head slowly, like he was trying to shake something loose. 50 years, he murmured. 50 years it sat there. The room stirred. Whispers. Someone wiped their eyes. Ruth, standing beside Eli, reached over and squeezed his arm without looking at him. Eli spoke then. Not because he had planned to. Because something inside him needed to come out. Something that had been building since the night he first opened that door in the dark. "I know what it feels like," he said, his voice quiet but steady, "to have something disappear and not know where it went. To wake up every morning and feel like the ground you're standing on doesn't mean anything anymore." The room went completely still. "I felt that for 6 years," he continued, "after I lost my family. I left this town. I left all of you. I went up that mountain and I stopped believing anything good could happen again." He paused. Harold felt the same thing, not grief exactly, but guilt, shame. He spent the last part of his life trying to fix what he broke, and he almost did it. He came so close. Eli looked out at the faces in front of him. At Mason, sitting near the middle of the room with his grandmother, his young face serious and attentive. At Ruth, her eyes bright with something she was working hard to hold back. At the old man in the back row who had worked in the mine and never forgotten what it cost him. "We can finish it for him," Eli said simply, "but only if we do it together. All of us, not just the money, the town, the school, the future. That's what he wanted, not a payout, a rebuild." The silence held for one more breath. Then Ruth stood up and said, in the clear, practical voice she had used to run a store for 40 years, "Well, who's in?" Hands went up, one at a time at first, then faster, then all at once. A room full of calloused, working hands rising into the air like something breaking the surface after being held underwater for too long. Pinnacle Resource Group did not disappear quietly. In the weeks that followed, Derek Harlan returned to Ridgemont 3 more times. Each visit was shorter than the last. Each time, he wore the same pressed coat and carried the same leather portfolio. Each time, he spoke to Patricia on the phone, not in person. His lawyers had advised against direct contact with the townspeople after the media attention. Their legal challenge came on a Monday in December, a formal objection to the trust petition, arguing that the vault sat on land whose ownership was disputed and that Harold Whitmore's undocumented intentions carried no legal weight without proper court verification. Patricia had expected it. She had prepared for it. The counterfiling took her team less than 48 hours to draft, and it was devastating in its clarity. Harold's journal documented the vault's construction in meticulous detail. The original land deeds, included in the manila envelope, showed that Harold had owned the mineral rights to the specific section of mountain where the vault was located at the time of his death. Those rights, under Montana law, passed to his estate and from his estate, through a series of documented transfers, eventually to the public domain when his estate was never formally settled. The vault, in other words, belonged to no one. And under the terms of Harold's proposed trust, which Patricia argued constituted a valid testamentary intention, even if never formally filed, it belonged to Ridgemont. The case went before a state judge in Missoula in January. It lasted 3 days. Pinnacle brought 4 lawyers. Patricia brought Harold's journal, the original documents, and 37 letters from residents of Ridgemont, handwritten, personal, devastating in their quiet honesty. Letters about what the town had lost, what it had become, what it could still be. The judge took 2 days to deliberate. When she issued her ruling, it was brief and unambiguous. The trust was validated. The assets would be transferred to the Ridgemont Community Trust, as Harold Whitmore had intended. Pinnacle Resource Group's claim was denied. Ruth called Eli from the courthouse. He was on the mountain, halfway between the vault and his cabin, when his phone buzzed, the one piece of modern technology he had allowed back into his life, a basic cell phone with barely enough signal to make calls on clear days. "It's done," Ruth said. Her voice was shaking, but not from cold. Eli stood on the mountainside, the phone pressed to his ear, and looked down at the valley below. Ridgemont sat there in the winter light, small and quiet and stubborn, exactly as it had been for decades. But something about it looked different now. Not the buildings, not the streets, something else, something invisible but real, like a held breath finally released. "Tell them," Eli said. "I will," Ruth said. Then, after a pause, "You should come down." "I will," he said. "Soon." He hung up and stood there for a long time, the cold pressing in around him, the mountain rising behind him like something ancient and patient that had finally decided to let go of its secret. The months that followed moved at a pace Ridgemont had not seen in decades. The trust board was formed, Ruth naturally at its center, along with Patricia, Mason's grandmother, and 3 other long-term residents who understood both the town's history and its needs. The first allocations were made in February. Funding for emergency repairs on the remaining homes, money for a medical clinic, a grant to reopen the elementary school by fall. Mason became involved almost immediately. He volunteered for everything, organizing supply runs, helping coordinate with contractors, carrying lumber and holding boards, while someone else nailed them into place. He worked with a quiet intensity that reminded Eli, every single time he watched the boy, of someone he had lost. But this time, the reminder didn't only bring pain. It brought something else too, something that felt like continuity. One afternoon in late March, Eli found Mason on the roof of the old school, hammering shingles in the thin spring sunlight. The boy worked in silence, focused, each stroke precise and purposeful. Eli climbed up the ladder and sat beside him on the roof's edge, legs dangling. The town spread out below them in a patchwork of old and new. They worked together for a while without speaking. Eli handed Mason nails. Mason drove them home. The rhythm was easy, natural, the kind of shared labor that doesn't require words. "It's going to be something," Mason said eventually, not looking up from his work. He gestured down at the town, at the new clinic being built on the corner, at the school's freshly painted entrance, at the small crowd of volunteers painting Ruth's store a cheerful shade of blue. "Yeah," Eli said. "It is." Mason paused, hammer resting against his knee. "My teacher, the one before the school closed, she used to say that a town is only as alive as the people who refuse to leave it." Eli smiled. It was a small smile, quiet, the kind that lived in the corners of the mouth. She was right. Mason looked at him. "You left." "I did. But you came back." Eli nodded slowly. "I did." The boy considered this for a moment. Then he went back to hammering, and they worked together in comfortable silence as the afternoon light stretched long and golden across the valley. Spring turned to summer. The school reopened on a Tuesday in September, its doors thrown wide for the first time in 3 years. 42 students walked through them on the first day, more than anyone had expected. Some were children of families who had quietly returned to Ridgemont over the summer, drawn back by the news, by the funding, by the sense that something was happening here that was worth being part of. Eli watched from the back of the crowd as the kids filed in. He didn't go inside. He wasn't a teacher anymore. That chapter of his life had closed on a cold February morning years ago, and he had made peace with it. But standing there, watching young faces full of curiosity and possibility walk through those doors, he felt something settle inside him. Not closure exactly, but alignment, like a compass needle finally finding north after years of spinning. Ruth found him afterward, standing alone at the edge of the schoolyard. She handed him a cup of coffee from a thermos she had brought, the way she always did, without being asked. "You know," she said, watching the last of the parents drift away, "Harold would have liked this." Eli took a sip. "Yeah," he said, "I think he would have." They stood together in the September warmth, two people who had both seen this town at its lowest and were now watching it take its first real breath in years. The mountain loomed behind them, enormous and ancient, no longer a place of secrets. Just a mountain, just land. Just the quiet, indifferent backdrop against which small, stubborn people had decided, once again, to build something worth believing in. One evening in October, Eli made the climb back up to the overhang for the last time. The vault had been emptied weeks ago, carefully, officially, under the supervision of Patricia and 2 representatives from the state. Every crate, every case, every bar of gold and silver had been documented, catalogued, and transferred to secure storage, pending the trust's distribution schedule. The paintings had been appraised by experts flown in from Missoula. 3 of them turned out to be works by artists whose names made the appraisers go quiet and still for a long moment before writing down numbers that seemed almost too large to be real. The rare coins alone added another $12 million to the total. $305 million, every cent accounted for. Every cent destined for the town Harold had spent his life destroying and his death trying to save. The vault was empty now, silent, just stone and timber and the memory of what had been kept here for 50 years. Eli descended the stairs one final time with a single lantern. The chamber echoed differently without the crates, bigger, emptier, more hollow. His footsteps rang against the stone floor like something final. Harold's desk still stood at the far end of the room. Patricia had offered to have it removed, catalogued as a historical artifact. Eli had asked her to leave it, just for now. He walked to the desk and set the lantern down beside it. The surface was bare, the journal and envelope long since removed, preserved, photographed, and filed as part of the legal record. But the wood still held the faint impression of where they had rested for decades, ghost outlines, the memory of weight. Eli reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. He had written it that morning, sitting at his cabin table in the early light, choosing each word with the same care Harold had once used. It was not long. It didn't need to be. He set it down on the desk in the center, exactly where Harold's journal had once sat. The letter read, "To whoever finds this place next, the vault above you is empty now. Everything that was here has been given to the town of Ridgemont, the way it was always meant to be." A man named Harold spent his last days trying to say sorry. It took 50 years and a stranger with nowhere else to go to finish the job. If you're reading this, then you found something too. Maybe not gold, maybe not money, but a door that was waiting to be opened. Don't walk away from it. The world needs people who don't walk away. Eli. He stood there for a moment, reading it back to himself in the lantern light. Then he turned and climbed the stairs for the last time, the flame dancing behind him as he ascended, casting one long shadow against the stone walls before the darkness swallowed it whole. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean. The stars had come out, thousands of them, scattered across the Montana sky like something spilled and never cleaned up. Eli sealed the door, replaced the key in its hiding place, and stood at the edge of the overhang, looking out at the valley below. Ridgemont glowed in the distance. Not brightly. It was still a small town, still quiet, still the kind of place the world forgot about between visits. But the lights were on, more of them than before. Windows lit with the warm yellow of families inside, living, eating, talking, existing in the way that small towns do when they have decided, collectively and without ceremony, that they are not finished yet. Eli watched the lights for a long time. The cold pressed against his face. The mountain breathed behind him, patient and indifferent as it had always been. But for the first time in 6 years, the indifference didn't feel like rejection. It felt like permission. Permission to stop running. Permission to put his feet down and stay. He turned up his collar against the wind and began the long walk back down. Ruth's store was still open when he reached the bottom of the mountain. It was always open, it seemed, no matter the hour. The bell above the door had been fixed. Someone, probably Mason, had replaced the spring, and it chimed softly as Eli stepped inside. Ruth was behind the counter, as always. Coffee was brewing. The store smelled like warmth and dust, and the particular kind of quiet that only exists in places where people have been gathering for generations. She looked up when he came in, smiled, poured him a cup without asking. Eli sat on the stool at the counter, the same stool he had sat on months ago, the first day he came back to town. He wrapped his hands around the mug and breathed in the steam. "How was the mountain?" Ruth asked. "Same as always," he said. She nodded, like that was exactly the answer she expected. Then she went back to restocking a shelf, humming that same low, tuneless song she always hummed, and the store settled back into its quiet rhythm. The hum of the cooler, the tick of the radiator, the soft sound of two people existing in the same space without needing to fill it with anything but presence. Outside, the town slept. The mountain watched. And somewhere beneath a cliff, in a sealed room that no one would open for a very long time, a letter waited on an empty desk. A small, quiet promise from one stranger to the next that some doors are worth opening and some secrets are worth telling, and sometimes the greatest thing a person can do with what they find is simply let it go where it was always meant to go. Anyone can stumble upon something great if they are willing to open a door when every instinct tells them to walk away. But it takes something rarer, something quieter, to take what you find and give it to someone else. That is not luck. That is not fortune. That is the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines. It just changes lives. Eli had come to this mountain to disappear. He had found instead a reason to stay. Not because the mountain had given him wealth or fame or recognition, but because it had given him what he had lost years ago on a cold February morning when two caskets sat side by side and the world split open beneath his feet. It had given him purpose. And in giving it away, in carrying Harold's secret out of the dark and into the light, in trusting a town full of strangers to do something meaningful with it, he had found something even rarer than gold. He had found his way home. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of discovery, redemption, and the kind of hope that changes everything. Click to keep watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones we keep. They're the ones we find the courage to give away.